From FingerLakes1.com, this is Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Durso, and today it's all about the words economic development. We hear them often, especially from elected officials and even candidates on the campaign trail. But what do they mean? What does the daily drive to creating economic development look like? To answer these questions and many others, we have Steve Griffin, CEO of the Finger Lakes Economic Development Center in studio. Steve, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So I guess the big question is, talk to us a little bit about yourself and how you actually got involved with economic development.
Well, it's kind of a hokey story. I was born and raised in Penn Yan, graduated from Penn Yan Academy. And after graduating from Niagara University, I went down to the Washington, D.C. area for a while, got involved in the technology sector down there, working with internet service providers before. This kind of dates me. Before people knew what the internet was, I remember trying to explain to my parents what I was doing, and they had no idea. And had a lot of success down there. The companies grew quickly. In fact, one of the technology companies I worked for, we had 13. I think I was the 13th employee, and 3.5 years later, we had 950 employees. I had about 150 people working for me. And I always thought about, when I was growing up, I was kind of frustrated because we were told over and over again, if you wanted a good job, if you wanted a good career, you had to leave the area. And I liked the area. I didn't know why that had to be. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, listen, we created a bunch of, it wasn't about the money, but I hired a lot of people down there. Why couldn't we do that same thing back here? So I had met my wife at the time down in D.C. She was from Fredonia. Right after 9/11, we said, let's head back home and start a family there, which we have. We got 2 beautiful kids. With the thought of working for a technology company to help create jobs. And while I was doing just some side consulting jobs, I saw an ad in the paper that said Genesee County Industrial Development Agency was looking for a deputy director. I'd never even heard of a deputy director before. Didn't know what that was, but they said the purpose of this job was to create jobs. I'm like, wow, there's actually there's an industry that does that. That's exactly what I want to do. So that was 15 plus years ago. Got involved with it, got offered the position to come to run Yates County's Industrial Development Agency job a little over 10 years ago. And that's how I got into the economic development. Now I'm back home with my family and kids. They love it, so it's happy to be back.
So what is the Finger Lakes Economic Development Center?
So our legal entity name is the Yates County Industrial Development Agency. Every county has an IDA. Yep. There's town IDAs, there's some village IDAs, there's city IDAs. We're the sole economic development agency for Yates County. We rebranded to the Finger Lakes Economic Development Center not long after I started, because outside of county employees or agencies, nobody really has any idea where county lines are. So Finger Lakes gets advertised, so we rebranded the Finger Lakes Economic Development Center. And our job and mission is to help build the economy of Yates County, work with the existing employers, help them expand, and obviously attract new companies in, help create jobs and capital investment.
So in terms that people understand, a lot of people probably heard that and are like, oh, so what does that? It seems a little ambiguous. Put that in sort of real terms. So how much money or how many businesses or how many jobs, like how's the success measured?
Success is measured usually in the public by the number of jobs that your projects create. That's a small facet now of actually what we do. I categorize, 5 to 10% of our job is actually presenting a tax incentive to a business to get them to locate here. 90 to 95% is all the other stuff. But the end results of it, in the last 10 years that I've been there, we've had tremendous success, a lot of growth. We have done over 320 projects now, and those, by a project, that's a company we directly assisted to get them to either locate in Yates County or expand in Yates County. So out of those 320 projects, 90 plus of them are new to Yates County. That could be a startup or it could be someone we attracted in. Those companies have planned to create over $270 million in capital investment and create over 1,670 jobs. You get to forecast out 3 years. It's been 10 years. We have the metrics that show off Department of Labor that our job growth has happened. In fact, we were mentioned before we came on air, Yates County is kind of in this weird little area where we're considered, rightly so, part of the Finger Lakes region, 9-county region as far as New York State's concerned. But for those, I always tell people, forget your geography when you're dealing with the regions according to New York State, because the Finger Lakes region goes all the way out to Genesee County, Wyoming County, Orleans County. Out of those 9 counties, Yates County since 2000 has led the region in percentage increase in new establishments, business establishments. Total jobs created, we've gone up 23% total jobs created to a flat, or actually a little negative over that same time for the region as a whole. Manufacturing is where the eyebrows peak up. We've grown 25% in our manufacturing jobs over that time, while the region unfortunately has lost a third. And then our tourism, which people more associate with Yates County because of the wineries and the lakes and the farms, we've gone up 81% per capita tourism revenue in the last 10 years. So tremendous amount of growth. International Economic Development Council named us one of the 7 most highly productive economic development organizations in the world. And there's 4 of us on the staff. Mm-hmm. One's dedicated to facilities. Right. So it's busy. There's been a tremendous amount of growth. It's a really exciting time, and we haven't done a good job ourselves, which I appreciate you for having us on, in bragging about that. People don't know everything going on down there.
Now, I want to piggyback off of one of the items you just mentioned, manufacturing, because it seems like there's this really divisive conversation happening out there in the Finger Lakes where it's some people just think manufacturing's dead completely, give up on trying to pull it back, but it seems as though you guys are having some success with getting manufacturing re-fired up.
We have, and we've been lucky. Like, it's our task, I believe, is to just help bring businesses in, get them started. We don't run them, obviously, luckily, probably, right? So, and we've been blessed to have some really good management teams in place for our manufacturers, so they continue to grow. The manufacturing jobs, though, they're there. In fact, in Yates County, I've talked to just 5 of our larger manufacturers. They have needs for 400 new employees over the next 3 years. So the growth is there. The problem that everyone's having, and that's not just here in the region, the Finger Lakes region as a whole has manufacturing jobs available. There's not enough labor to fill them. The available skilled labor right now is the biggest challenge.
Skilled labor. That seems to be the caveat that a lot of people get hung up on. They think manufacturing, and they think back 30, 40 years ago when you could graduate from high school and just sort of walk into an industry and just work there for 40 years until you retire. It's skilled now. It's sort of it's a honed change, right?
If you have the skills to run a CNC machine, to mm-hmm. do some problem solving, then you're going to be hired immediately and you're going to make a good living. A lot of our manufacturers right now are starting people out around the $20 to $22 an hour range. They're making $58,000 in 2 years. So they're making a good life for themselves. Where it's shifted to now is have a good professional demeanor about yourself, show up to work on time, put in a hard day's work, be productive while you're there, and if you have the aptitude to learn, the employers will teach you the skills you need to succeed there. It's really about broadening, I think, the awareness of, even down into the high school ranks, which is in middle school, we're working heavily on that, getting them to understand what manufacturing is. I think they think it's a dirty, grimy, dusty place and you're picking a widget off of a belt and putting it into a box.
Right.
It's obviously a lot more than that, and it's we just have to have a kind of a little bit of a fundamental mind shift on what these careers are for people.
Now, your roots obviously are in the technology sector. How important is technology in this entire discussion around economic development, especially in rural places where it's difficult to physically get to and interact and touch these people on a daily basis?
So it's obviously important, right? So the technology, depending on what kind of technology you're talking about, if there's not a business out there operating that doesn't utilize technology in some way to make their business more efficient, more productive, using the same amount of labor. And that's one of the challenges we have in economic development that we've seen a big shift in. As companies invest more in technology, it's usually at a direct counter to hiring more people. Mm-hmm. And so we tend to, if we help a company make a large investment in technology, the big job creators generally aren't there as much anymore because they're investing so heavily in automation and technology to make the labor they have more efficient, that it tends to be challenged in that public perception. Well, how many jobs are they creating? It's as much as sustaining the current employment. The technology is big, and the county's working on expanding broadband even further throughout our region. Vitally important as we continue to see an increase in telecommuters, teleworker, right, who are working remotely, not at the corporate office. And if we can't give them, in this case, the high-speed bandwidth they need to be able to video conference with their employer, to teleconference in, to send the big files and projects they're working on, then we're going to be left behind. And we're seeing a lot of success right now with that. There's a new wave of younger professionals moving to Yates County and working remotely. It's kind of neat to see.
How you sort of touched on it a little bit there, but really how important, because we had the Yates County Legislature Chairman, Dr. Tim Dennis, on a couple weeks ago, and he was really proud of the fact that Yates County was pursuing broadband expansion. Obviously, like you just said, that's big for telecommuters and people who work remotely and things like that, but that's also big for people who just want to be able to, call anywhere in Yates County home and have reliable internet service, right?
Absolutely. If we don't have, we have to be able to provide the same speed for our businesses that you can find in an urban center, right? It's just as important. If maybe not even, you could argue, maybe more important to them, right? Because of the location. If we're geographically further removed from an urban center, then we have to be able to let those companies be able to get their files, get their products, whatever it is, quicker to those cities. As it comes to what kind of gets forgotten, people don't think necessarily about, is even from the agricultural perspective. A lot of the farms, the production farms, they're commodity based. They're trying to figure out where the prices are highest and sell them, and they're operating on very, very slow internet. So we have fiber coming through now. It's helped out sort of our core centers of the county where the populations are. The next big challenge is spreading that even further, those last miles that it's always called, to some of the areas that maybe aren't as dense as far as population, to be able to allow those people to also have some internet. We're working with New York State right now. The Lieutenant Governor was in the other day. The mapping that New York State uses to show areas that are served is flawed. It says, yes, you're served by broadband internet, and in fact you aren't. And so the county's putting forth the next step in this, which is really going out doing a survey to let people say, no, we don't have internet, so we can take that back to the state. Like, we need some more help here.
Now, when you talk to businesses, you're sort of that facilitator between the business and the community itself. What are the needs that you hear most frequently, or what are some of the wish list items that these, whether they're businesses that are already there or businesses looking to relocate into the area?
So it used to be in our industry, it was, you hear location, right? How close are you to a throughway? How close are you to an interstate? That's been replaced now to where it's labor. Mm-hmm. And it's across the country. It's not just a Yates County challenge. It's not a Finger Lakes challenge. It's a countrywide national challenge here. So that is far and away the number one factor that companies are looking at when they decide to locate and or expand. So a lot of our time, a lot of our focus and energy right now, not just ours, but and economic development in general, is around workforce development initiatives. So we're spending a tremendous amount of time in our school systems, with our workforce development office, with our nonprofits, to figure out how to put the basic skills in some of those looking for employment, give them the basic skills they need to at least enter the workforce, and then again, as we mentioned earlier, let the employers train them in the skills they need. So what are they looking for outside of the basics, right? You got to be able to have the infrastructure, the land available to them, available buildings and sites. But if you can't prove to them you have the labor, then it doesn't matter.
That's obviously you're battling cold right now, so our listeners
please forgive me.
Yeah, a lot of people we interview, we talk to, it's always a lot of, well, there needs to be better prioritization. So I guess my question is, as an economic developer, what kind of advice do you give to elected officials or leaders, local leaders, whatever the case may be, when they say, well, how should we prioritize, or what should we prioritize? Because if the businesses and the companies coming in and talking to you are saying, we need people more than we need infrastructure, Obviously, infrastructure is usually one of the first things that sort of gets cherry-picked as an item that is totally necessary and totally necessary to be improved to foster more economic development. So how do you sort of have that conversation where you're like, the people end of it's a little more important?
So the prioritization kind of breaks down between what those factors you can more easily control and those that are a little bit harder to control. So locally, infrastructure is still important. You see, especially in areas like Yates County, like Seneca County, where agribusiness, food manufacturing is a major economic engine for us. The infrastructure becomes really important. You need to have good wastewater facilities and treatment facilities, and that's extremely important. You can work locally. We have our manufacturers working directly with our tech teachers in our high schools to tweak some of the curriculums how they're going about teaching the students, so that they're now applying instruction and lessons that the employers can directly use, that they're using themselves. They're using the same CAD programs now, so that when the students come out, they're aware of what that manufacturing is, how they can be vital. So as far as the prioritization, you need the infrastructure, because you have to be able to supply your companies. But part of that infrastructure is also that labor. So from a county perspective, it's really beefing up the workforce development offices and the trainings and the skill sets that they're able to provide our employers. The stuff we can't control, or we don't have as much control over, is at the state level. We got to get New York State investing more heavily directly in training funds that can go to the employers. And then, as much as you can, get them to help reduce the cost of operating in New York.
Okay, so I was gonna ask that question a little later, but you've jumped into it, so I want to jump right on that now. What is that? I was going to say, what are, say, the top 2 or 3 things, you seem to identify them, that the state is doing or does that has an impact on what you guys do? But to that end, what is the most important thing that New York State does? Is it that they invest in the people side? I
believe so. Right. So if there's a couple things they could do. We have been very successful in Yates County, mainly because we tried to reduce the burden of a business to operate in Yates County. So for our factors, we've reduced fees, we've reduced costs, we've dropped interest rates on our loan funds to help the businesses succeed. New York State could do a lot of those same things. It'd be easy, right? There's no reason that the scaffold law is still out there, right? Mm-hmm. Workers' comp costs can come down. There continues to be additional pressures on especially small businesses when you start putting in minimum wage increase mandates instead of letting the free market tell you when wages should increase. Paid family leave, right? These are really hard laws for small business to implement. It has really hard negative consequences on their bottom lines, and they don't have any time to try to adapt for it and be ready for it. So I think New York State could just be a little bit more cognizant of some of the these broad brush strokes that make sense when you say them, when you talk about who wouldn't want people to make more money, right? So, but it's hard to just overnight all of a sudden mandate these high wages with people that the small business is really struggling. I don't think there's an understanding all the time from New York State what it's like to operate a small business, and we are a region basically of small business.
Mm-hmm. You must have, having worked so closely with a lot of these small businesses, you must have an appreciation for how small the margins are for many of them. Talk to us a little bit about that side of it and kind of bring that home for people, because I think even when you're talking about small businesses, there are a contingency of folks out there who say, well, they have money, they can afford to do it, That isn't always necessarily the case.
I think, predominantly speaking, people would invest in their employees more if they had the funds to do it. Now, there are those who probably do maybe take advantage of the situation a little bit more, but we are starting to see now in Yates County, anyways, we had this weird dichotomy going on forever, where we're amongst the lowest unemployment rates in the state for a decade plus, but yet our wages were also about the lowest in New York State for a decade plus. So supply and demand, for whatever reason, didn't seem to be working up until recently. We're now finally seeing that upward pressure on our employers to raise their wages, to fight for this labor pool, because we've brought in more businesses and those who have expanded. The margins that if you're talking about our downtown development's really important right now. So one of the things we need to do is create a better living environment, bring in more cultural and recreational amenities, experience-based retail, restaurants, that sort of thing. When you start mandating minimum wage impacts and paid family leave and this new schedule that Governor Cuomo wants to put in, where you have to give notice of when their schedules are going to change. What if it snows and you have a snowstorm and you got to send employees home? Now you got to pay them for the entire rest of that day's pay, and if you're a retailer, you're not bringing any more money in, right? So there's a lot. People tend to focus just on the employee, not understanding that the employer a lot of time is covering huge jumps in health insurance costs, and the employee doesn't see that because it's not on their paycheck. But when health costs are going up 30% a year, that's tough to handle.
So obviously, one of the things you mentioned earlier, the words everyone seems to hate, really cynical about, Industrial Development Agency. They hand out tax incentives. They're stealing our tax dollars, yada, yada, yada. I'm sure you've heard it many, many times. I'm sure you hear it all the time in your day-to-day operation. How do you respond to it? How do you respond to those critics who say you're giving unnecessary breaks? How do you respond to that and sort of bring back the positive of, this is about bringing jobs. This is about bringing economic development to the area?
I think the thing I'm probably most proud of in Yates County is the culture we now have there. We don't hear that very rarely. It's rare anymore. Now, that wasn't the case when I started, but we've created an environment there mainly by just communicating with people, talking about the programs, how they work, why they're needed. And I hear it across the state when I'm at different state functions where people are getting that a lot. And I'm always kind of curious about it. I think you need to take the time to go educate your community about what they are. So I mentioned the other stuff we do, right? So the tax incentives come in. They're sort of the icing on the cake. If there's all this pre-work that goes into it by convincing them you have the labor, by working with your high schools, your middle schools, with your workforce development, working with your towns and your villages and your cities to get infrastructure put in. And when you eventually get to the place where, okay, now we're talking about costs, IDAs were created because state government and local government created a high tax area in which businesses have to operate in. They were purposely created to help, I call, undo the harm they created, right? So our taxes come in, our tax breaks come in and help reduce the cost of the expenses. Companies outlay a lot of money, the taxes come in. Now, I'd say probably 95 times out of 100, at least in Yates County, I'm really sure this is the case throughout the state as well. The tax breaks come on the increased assessed value. So ABC Manufacturing Company has a plant they're putting on. It's assessed at $1 million. They're putting on $1 million expansion. The tax breaks only apply to that new $1 million expansion. So the company continues to pay. I'm going to make up a number. Let's say they're paying $10,000 a year in property taxes. They keep paying that $10,000. It's the tax breaks come on the new assessed value, part. Right? So they're instead of their taxes doubling that first year after they just spent all this money to build it. In our case, if it's a manufacturer, they don't pay any of that additional $10,000 for 5 more years. Right. And every county's different a little bit in how that works, but it's always as far as what the breaks are. But they're always going to make a payment still. We're very rarely taking anything away from the tax funds. It all shifts over to the tax exempt rolls, so it'll say they're not paying any taxes, which is technically true, but what they're doing instead is making a pilot payment or a payment in lieu of tax. They're still paying everything they were paying. This is just
nobody's getting out of paying taxes.
Right. It's just on the increased value. In fact, I need to update this for my next annual meeting. At our annual meeting 2 years ago, I gave an update. We had 18 active pilots, tax incentives that we gave a company. The base value of those projects were $4.5 million. So that pre-expansion value had a base assessed value of just $4.5 million. Mm-hmm. When it's all said and done, the new value, including the base, will add almost $38 million in new value. That's $1 million a year in additional tax revenue that the communities will see because of those incentives. That these businesses wouldn't do it without the tax incentives. Mm-hmm. So it's a tough environment out there, and if you don't give these companies the incentives they need to grow, they can do it elsewhere.
Now, talk to us a little bit about what the difference is as we wind down here between, say, like a Yates County, an Ontario County, a Wayne County. Obviously, each one of those, it would seem, you have to sort of sell to your own values, your own strengths. But what's that sort of competitive dynamic like when you are ultimately competing for companies to come to Yates County as opposed to Seneca County or Ontario County?
We actually collaborate quite a bit with one another. The local economic development heads of each county. I talk with Bob Aronson from Seneca County a lot, and Peg Churchill and Mike Manikowski from the different counties. We talk quite a bit with each other. I think we all almost fit our own niche, right? So Ontario County has started to see a lot more in technology. They're a little bit closer to Rochester. You're seeing a lot of the photonics industry in Rochester spread a little bit more into the Victor and Farmington area. I think there's a lot of similarities between Seneca and Yates, between the agricultural aspect of it. There's still a really strong manufacturing environment. I think it's really about having, at that point, I think it'd be a slightly challenging to say why one's a little bit better than the other. Our advantage is we provide a very low cost place to operate. Unfortunately, currently our wages are still pretty low. Our tax rates as compared to other parts of New York are extremely low. We get the benefit of the Finger Lakes and the high property values on the lakes that generally don't send kids to schools. And then we also have about 20% of our population is Mennonite, who do pay property taxes, but they also don't send kids to school. So our school has a decent amount of income coming in, and not necessarily maybe the amount of product, if you will, if the students are product, to support. So our school tax rates are very low. So when you take a look at compared maybe to a Seneca County, to an Ontario County, we have a very low property tax rate as well. So we all fit a different niche, and I think it's really just proving to that company where will they be able to get in and operate quickest. And that's again where I point back to the environment we've created in Yates County, where it's really, really supportive of businesses coming in and expanding.
Last question for you. Biggest success in your time with the FLEDC. What has been sort of that biggest win or biggest change that you've seen overall in terms of economic development?
Outside of an actual product, I'm gonna point back to that attitude. When I first started, I was surprised at how people talk to one another. How government, different townships were sort of maybe not necessarily cooperative with one another. There was lots of infighting, and we just started having people talk to each other. I mean, we literally had political officials going up to developers while they're in the middle of a project saying, "That's never going to work here." And please tell me you didn't say that. Well, yeah. So
I'm laughing because it seems ridiculous.
Yeah, well, but it happens, right? Because it's a lot of the times there's they hadn't been there before. We have 3 hotels now in the village of Penn Yan. No one thought one would work. All 3 are successful. So it's really my very first public speaking engagement in Yates County. I finished it with, "We have to scream louder than the pessimists," and I've done it every single presentation thereafter. And our local media partners are so great for us. They show news articles and projects in a positive light. Our school systems let us come in whenever we need them to. Our towns are talking. We get our town supervisors together just to talk. We get our manufacturers together just to talk. And if I had anything, I'd point back to that and say that it's taken a decade, but you don't hear any longer about that can't work here. What you hear now is, hey, what's coming next, which is it's a much easier environment in which to operate. And I'm happy and thankful that our community's done that.
Well, I really appreciate you coming in today to talk to us about all this. And, of course, in the future, anytime you want to come back and talk about some of these great things that are happening in Yates County, feel free.
I would love to. We're big fans of All1 down in Yates County.
Happy to hear it. Well, that is going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank Steve, our listeners, and, of course, FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Inside the FLX airs Sundays at 7 p.m. on Spectrum Channel 12 and is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.